Many young athletes struggle with discipline, consistency, and accountability. But what many young athletes don't know is that something as simple as setting goals is scientifically proven to increase your consistency and your performance. I am thrilled to be working with the company Sports Hogs. It is a family-run company that specializes in making journals where you can track your process goals. Each journal, here's mine for basketball, gives you an opportunity to list your goals, how you want to implement them, and then gives you opportunities to not only reflect on goals in your workouts, but also reflect on each game performance over the course of the season. My favorite part of these Sports Hogs journals is the space where you as an athlete can list positive affirmations to keep yourself motivated. And if you need a little extra positivity, there are great quotes from legendary athletes filled in the journal. This family did an outstanding job creating resources for young athletes all over the country. And if you want to take advantage of this resource, visit sportshogs.com. That's sportshogs.com. Get a hand on your journal today. Greetings, information superhighway, and welcome to episode 13 of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. My name is Jared Zeidman. I've got a great interview with a great guest headed your way. But first, guess what? The New York Metropolitans Baseball Club has made the playoffs. One of the best regular season baseball games I can remember in the last 20 years, featuring just unbelievable late inning theatrics, capped off by, an unforgettable Francisco Lindor home run. And this team has capped off not only an historic rally by baseball standards to make the playoffs, but a completely unconventional year by New York Mets standards. The Mets are a team that jumps out ahead early, hangs on in September, and limps to the finish line. That is what they do. And for this team that is supposed to be in the rebuilding phase with only a couple cornerstone pieces, for them to get the incredible performances that they've gotten from, what looks a lot like a Moneyball island of misfit toys starting pitching rotation, the heart and hustle from their core players, Lindor, Nimmo, Alonso, great everyday play, and just the energy that some of the young Cubs have brought in, specifically the late addition of Luis Angel Acuna. This is just such an exciting team to watch. And by the time this podcast is out, the playoffs will start. Mother Nature handed this team a bad hand, and they really did incredible with it. It's just so exciting. And one thing that I want to call attention to, because after all, I am a coach, a very, very gutsy decision during that game that I want to call attention to, because had this backfired, we would be talking about this nonstop. Edwin Diaz blew a 2-inning save in the 8th inning. The Braves rally. Edwin Diaz goes back out in the 9th inning after the Mets retake the lead and ends up getting the win. And the trust and the confidence that gesture must have put into their closer by Mets management is just the type of stuff that you love about the relationships that athletes have with managers and coaches. I did not expect him to go back out for the 9th. As a fan, I was nervous when he went back out for the 9th, but the fact that he immediately regained his composure, got the win instead of the save after Lindor's home run, those are the kind of things that can really amplify an athlete's confidence heading into the next segment of the season. And I really hope that even if you're not a huge Mets fan, you can take a lesson from that moment, whether you're the coach or the athlete. If you have people around you that are not giving up on you, it's really important to not give up on yourself, even when it's challenging. On the subject of that, I do not have a proverbial question of the week for you to answer this year from a recruiting perspective, but I do have a short story that I'd like to share that I just went through with a client, and I asked her permission if I could share this, and she gave me her permission, so I'm going to share it. So with that, true recruiting story. A young female athlete I'm working with just finishes her final AAU season. She's a rising senior in high school. She's being recruited by a lot of different places, but she hasn't really narrowed her list yet. One of the reasons why she hasn't narrowed her list is because she doesn't really know where she stands with a lot of the schools that she's in the mix with. Every coach and every staff communicates differently, so she's just kind of been going on what they say. I ask her if she has her preferred choices, and she gives me her top 5 schools. And I tell her that I think she needs to send an email to the head coaches at these 5 places and basically say, hey, you're in my top tier. I really want to start narrowing my list and moving forward and figuring out which schools I'm going to pour the most time into in the fall with my visits. Can you please let me know where I stand on your list? And she was very uncomfortable about doing this. And when I pressed her on it, I think she was really nervous about the rejection component. What if one of these coaches say, no, I think we're going to move in a different direction. Thanks for your interest. We'll let you know if anything changes. And I've been young before. That really stings. That could be a really tough thing to hear. What I shared with her was, but what if they say yes? And they were waiting to see how interested you were, and you didn't convey it, and they didn't really know where you stood. By taking this initiative, you have an opportunity to create a clear channel of communication and get clear communication back. So the first thing I will share with you is one of the schools on that list did reply back to her and tell her they were no longer interested. And that, was tough to experience and tough for her to hear, as it would be tough for anyone to hear. But another school, her top choice, emailed her back and said, let's get on the phone as soon as we can because we want to offer you a roster spot and we really want you here. Flash forward, barely even a month later, she's done an official visit with the campus and she's committing there to be a student athlete. It's not just about betting on yourself. It's not just about doing the things in the process correctly. It is consistently about taking initiative. You let people know where you stand and you wait and see how they respond. You find the place that's the best fit for you. You state your intentions clearly. And I really hope that if you're a recruit or a family of recruit listening, that you take that message to heart. The worst thing that could happen is somebody says no. And college basketball is a sport that is built on resilience from no's. You miss a shot, figure out how to do it better. You get beat on defense, figure out how to do it better. We get information, we react to the information, we move forward, but we always take initiative. That's what we do. So to this young recruit and her family, if you are listening, congratulations. It's a really, really exciting time, and thank you for betting on yourself to take that initiative. Look how it paid off. Now, on the subject of taking initiative, I want to talk briefly about last week's podcast to set up our guest this week. Last week, we had on another recruiting expert, Coach Allison Roberts, with a great interview. One of the questions I asked her was, and I'm quoting here, what advice would you give an athlete that's a late bloomer who might be flying under the radar? Without hesitation, Coach Roberts replied, get in the weight room. Now, remember that this part of our season is about the how. You've heard a lot of coaches talking about what they're looking for. I want to make sure that you have access to the information about how to do it. With that weight room thing in mind, I have found a guest who I think is going to talk to you in great simple terms about strength and conditioning. His name is Chase Skinkis. And if you're a hooper that's really been following social media and basketball for the last little bit, that name might be a little bit familiar to you because he is a world-renowned dunker. There is a subculture in basketball around dunk contests, and Chase Skinkis has traveled the world dunking on and over literally everybody. This is a guy that used his leaping ability to create a brand for himself. And not only elevate his own brand, but teach other people how to use their bodies more efficiently. The NBA caught wind of him and have actually been using him as a consultant for their dunk contests. He works with NBA All-Star Weekend players on their slam dunk routines, helping them jump higher, prep different, and approach the slam dunk contest. That's a pretty awesome resume to have. But the thing I like the most about him, and you'll hear him talk about this in this interview, is it was never about dunking. It was about getting better at basketball. And at a very interesting time in his life, he decided that he wanted to push the limits of his basketball ability. The guest I have today was not a high school All-American. Chase Skinkis wasn't a college All-American either. In fact, I'm almost 100% sure he wasn't even a varsity college athlete. He went to school to be an engineer. He still is an engineer to this day. And that scientific mind of his inspired him in his early 20s to bet on himself and really learn sports science and how he could push his body to peak ability so that he could get better at basketball. The end result, well, it's everything you just heard. But let's get behind the metrics a little bit. He has a 4-foot vertical leap. That's pretty crazy. He trained himself to do that. He trained himself to get stronger, to handle the physicality of basketball more. And now he's the co-owner of Project Pure Athlete, and he's teaching young people exactly what he did to get himself to the next level with all of the data and metrics behind it. So we talk about how it's never too late to get going on something. And if you're a late bloomer, you're about to hear from what I would describe as the latest bloomer. This is a guy that was playing professional ball overseas, not just dunking, but playing professional ball after not being an elite athlete in high school or college. He worked his way into this. And now he is joining me to talk to you about the work. Specific things you should be on the lookout for in this interview. Talks about the science behind it, why strength and conditioning is so important, what you could be doing even as a young athlete or the parents of a young athlete who's just getting started with basketball to get their bodies more used to the impact of the game of basketball, specific exercises that will help you work on injury prevention, and then my personal favorite part, what strength and conditioning actually does for basketball players. And I'm so excited for you to hear it from someone who has literally traveled the world because of the way that his strength and conditioning regimen impacted his performance playing basketball. Now, just for kicks, I'm going to include some video footage in the podcast description, some links to some video footage, I should say, because my favorite part of this is when he talks about his Bellagio moment dunk. And you'll listen to the interview and you'll learn what that means. But he describes a dunk that he taught to eventual slam dunk contest winner Larry Nance Jr. I'm going to include some video of that dunk so you could see it for yourself. It's pretty wild. So this is the first of a 3-part series on how. Today we tackle strength and conditioning. Next week, we're going to be talking to 2 outstanding skill development basketball trainers. And 2 weeks from now, you're going to hear one of the most inspiring stories about earning a scholarship that you'll ever hear anywhere. But we start here. We start in the weight room. The recruiting experts have spoken, and this is the thing that sets you apart, your athletic ability that is developed in the weight room. These are things that you can do. Now listen to somebody tell you the time commitment it takes, what it looks like, and how it will help you. Chase Skinkis, let's dive in. In his awesome lab in Las Vegas, Nevada, it's Coach Chase Skinkis. How's everything going, Coach?
Things are great. It's kind of that time where everybody's getting back to overseas or getting back to school, so it's a little bit more downtime in terms of work, a little bit more dad time.
we're working on dad time here too. My little guy just started smiling, so we're in different phases. I'm definitely going to be leaning on you as my guy gets a little bit older and starts handling physicality on a basketball court for the first time.
There you go. Yeah.
But this is great, and you and I obviously know this, but I want to kind of outline this for our listeners. The first half of this season of the podcast has been a lot of interviews with college coaches, a few players, a few former athletes, but really just a consensus of what college coaches are looking for and what college players think you should expect. And something that's come up constantly, Coach, is this idea of the work and what hard work looks like. So when I think of people who embody actually doing the work that could talk to our listeners about, what the work actually looks and feels like, I think that's why I'm so excited to have you here. So I want to actually start right there because you have an online presence and a television presence as one of the jump guys. You're an elite dunker And I know there's more to that story, but I also want the listeners to know about your relationship with the game of basketball. So can you just to start talk us through your high school and college experiences as a basketball player, and how did your love of this game really start?
So for me, it was basically like love at first sight. In that when I was a little kid, I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I saw three kids, a few brothers playing together at a park. Two of them were my age, and it's working out with their older brother, and they were just there shooting hoops. I'd never seen it before, and instantly I kind of gravitated to it. And from then, every time there was a basketball game on TV, anytime that like I just watched it and consumed it as much as possible. It was something that instantly drew me in, and still to this day, it's something I kind of live my life by and obsess over. That's kind of like how I fell in love with the game. From there, it was just being a kid that moved around a lot. I lived in so many different places. I went to 13 different schools over the years, right? So
Wow.
it's a kind of a unique experience in that everywhere I went, I had the kind of didn't have any friends for a while, right? So I got to spend a lot of time with the game, and it was something that I could enjoy and to put time into, while also being able to use that as a vehicle to make friends. So basketball's played a big part in my life. In terms of like how it went for me as a career, it started off slow, and just like many kids, like especially in some of these rural areas, I lived in a bunch of small towns. There wasn't a lot of great experience to lean on in terms of how to develop as a basketball player. So even though I was out shooting a lot or spending a lot of time, I wasn't necessarily doing things that were going to help me become a better basketball player all the time. Standstill jumpers and things like that, right? So with that, struggled early on and in my kind of career, and got better at it. It's something that continued to grow. So it's kind of lackluster college experience, and really blossomed after that. Right. So after I left college, that was a time where I really began to learn a lot more about how to develop as a player. I spent a lot of time on my game. Eventually, got to play overseas. Eventually, got to play some minor pro basketball, things like that. But it led to so many other avenues. That the love for basketball led to the love of training. It eventually, I said in college, that's where it was a lackluster career because I was small, I was weak, I wasn't fast, right? So I had to overcome those obstacles, and in the journey of trying to overcome it, to continue playing, to continue chasing the dream of playing basketball further. That's where I fell in love with the training side of things as well.
Now, I certainly don't want to blow up your entire spot privately, but there is one thing about your professional lens that I really respect, which is that you're also an engineer. You're an engineer by trade. And just in my previous conversations with you, you have a very pragmatic approach to the work that you're doing. So if you don't mind, I almost want you to put your put your engineer hat on for a moment and kind of walk our listeners through when you started learning about how you could improve yourself, because under your own admission, you kind of went from really, really enjoying the game and working hard at it to then flipping a switch, keeping all those things, but transforming yourself physically. So I would love to know, like, what was it that you were exposed to? Because to me, it's almost like you have two parallels. There's this love of the game, but it is your scientific approach to improvement that has now sort of carried you into this other phase of your career that I'm also really interested in.
So absolutely, it was kind of looking at things differently. So at that time, this was kind of pre cell phones, where you could, pre YouTube and all that kind of stuff, dating myself there, but it wasn't as easy to just find great information. Right. And
Right.
it's not always easy now. You still got to have a lot of, you have to sift through all the information and try to figure out what's valuable. Right. But at that time, it was Slam magazine. It was like little simple things like that. I bought some programs. I tried those out. Got to college, started lifting weights more, things like that. Um, Decided that some of this stuff was working, some of it wasn't. Using back then we're using a lot of kind of track and field advice or football advice, and while it was helpful, I always knew there was something missing. And for me, it was like I would get fairly strong, and I'd maybe get on a fast break, right? And you're running as fast as you can on a fast break, and I would be just so fearful of those last few steps. So like, am I going to blow through this? Am I going to even
Like the
jump off the
load.
ground? Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
And I knew that there was something missing in terms of how I was approaching that versus other people. And YouTube really changed the game. Right. Once YouTube came out and I started seeing these other people dunk, I started to really kind of use that kind of physics lens to look at what they were doing and then I started recording myself, and I noticed that there was positions that they were hitting that I wasn't. And I saw this
Mm.
consistently on people who were very good jumpers. There was positions that they were consistently hitting that I tried to then learn how to reproduce. And then I started trying to think about, okay, why are these positions important? And start looking at it from, like I said, from a physics standpoint rather than a what are my muscles doing standpoint. Like, how are we interacting with the ground? What's the force direction that we're bringing into the equation with our approach? How is that kind of transitioning into our conversion phase and so on? And came up with these ideas, started testing them out, trying to get myself to learn these positions, and noticed a big improvements, right? So when I initially tested for all through high school and all this sort of stuff, I generally had about a 1 to 2 inch difference between my standing jump and my approach jump.
Mm.
Sometimes those are one-step approaches, sometimes they're three-step approaches, or sometimes they're max approaches. It didn't really matter. I couldn't really jump higher
Mm.
off of an approach. Then
And
I
just for
Yep.
context, because I'd love to ask this, when you say max approach, you're talking about like that full 1-2 gather and really explode off the ground.
Yeah, so when people test approach or test jumps, right, you have the standing vertical jump where your feet don't move, right?
Sure.
Then you have sometimes they'll have you test a one-step approach, which is just like you pushing one step into the jump. NBA combine testing, they have a 15-foot maximum, right? So yeah, you can do however many steps you want, but you have 15 feet to do it, right? So
Got
generally for people, that's a 2 to 3 step approach. Then you have max approach jumping, which is where one leg jumpers and things like that really get an advantage that they can bring in more speed that they can convert into vertical after that, right?
Sure.
So that's how we're measuring it that way. Well, by the time I peaked out, I was jumping about 12 inches higher off of my approach than I was off my standing. I mean, I've
It's
tested thousands and thousands over the years. I think that most people can get in that 4 to 6 range with good technique. And then people who are really optimize it, you can get that 8 to 12 range.
it's crazy to hear you say I was never a leaper. So when you're talking about an improvement that is basically only like 2 inches less than my total vert. And just to, I don't want to blow up your spot, but your peak, as I understand it, is you have jumped 4 feet in the air, correct?
Yeah, I've hit my head I'm 6 foot tall. I've hit my head on the rim, had to get staples, the whole deal. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot
That
less
is,
fun than it sounds
may I
like.
add, the raddest way to get staples ever. Like
It's a lot
if it's
less
going
fun
to
than it sounds
happen,
like, for
that's a
sure.
really cool way to have it happen.
It was exciting to do it, and it was painful at the same time.
I bet. So I want to sort of piggyback on this because I imagine this athletic improvement takes you in a number of different ways. You already shared with us how it gives you a lens into literally playing this game that you love professionally overseas, which has got to be like the ultimate rush, especially after your younger experience. We talk so much, and we've talked behind the scenes just as coaches. We talk to young people all the time about how this happens differently for everybody. So
Yeah.
you are someone that has, really maximized post collegiately. This game takes you all over the world. I want to sort of bring you back to the States now because you start having a really cool opportunity a little less than 10 years ago to collaborate with the NBA for the dunk contest. And I don't want to get you in trouble, but I would love for you to share whatever you're allowed to share about NBA dunk contest prep because, and I'll talk to you more about the why in a moment, but you and I grew up, in the heightened time of the dunk contest. And, I'll pick your brain more about that in a moment, but like, what was that like and how did you get into it?
So through doing professional dunk contests over the years, I was able to kind of link up with people who eventually became some kind of decision makers and consultants behind the scenes in the
Okay.
dunk contest world, right? So that's one way in, is that I just became known by the people who kind of mattered at that point behind the scenes. Then in some of these scenarios, I was able to tell my story, right? So I did Dunk King, which was produced by the people who did American Ninja Warrior. So it's kind of very shot in a very similar way, in that they give a little bit of a backstory, and they took a liking to my backstory and let me tell it a little bit on one of the episodes. So that helped kind of broaden people's or broaden my appeal to people who maybe hadn't heard what my backstory of not being able to dunk in high school and becoming a professional dunker. So that opened up some minds as to, okay, what do you mean you couldn't dunk in high school, and you're doing these sorts of things, competing with the best dunkers in the world. So that kind of just put me on the map a little bit in a different way. Fast forward a couple of years, one of the an agent that is a friend of mine. He had a client get in the NBA dunk contest. Kind of last minute, he was a guy who was a big underdog, wasn't seen as a dunker, right? And he knew of this guy Chuck Milan, who was a friend of his, and Chuck and me were hired to help this guy Glenn Robinson III. Well, Glenn was a 17-1 underdog at one point, and he ended up winning the NBA dunk contest. We had 4 practices to help him do it. He never dunked over anybody in his life. He'd never done anything really, basically, other than a 360 windmill was kind of his go-to dunk, which is a great dunk. But it's it all comes down to the preparation. Now, over my years of competing in dunk contests, it was my preparation that allowed me to compete with people who were better than me. All right, there's a lot of people who could jump really high, even some that jump higher than the 48 inches or whatnot. A lot of people were better dunkers than me, but I was able to compete in dunk contests by treating it like a professional and approach the mindset of how I was going to do each dunk. I took it very seriously. I stood in the same spots. I threw the ball in the same spot. I wanted to make sure I made my dunks, and that was the most important part. Chuck gave me really good advice one time at a dunk contest. He said, rule number 1 through 10 is you got to make your dunk. You can't worry so much about what everybody else is doing. You got to worry about doing the best that you can do and putting on the best show for you. Right. So we took this advice and helped, I started analyzing Glenn's approaches and the things that he was good at. We came up with game plans, and he ended up going out and winning the dunk contest, making all his dunks, getting 50s, the whole deal. One of the people who run the event for the NBA, they were there at our practice session. We were kind of jerks and didn't show them anything, and they weren't happy
so
about that.
As in kind of like they wanted to know what you were going to do, and you were like,
yeah, they want to know everything. And I was aware that there was other people in the gym. So we wanted it to be a shock value, right? So
yeah,
we purposely sandbagged the session. I tried to work separately with the camera guys and say, hey, we're going to approach from here. This is what we're going to do. This is the angles that you want, that sort of stuff to make sure the show was good. But nobody had seen the dunks. We actually went to a high school later that night to get another practice session in rather than but next day, the guy's like, don't ever do that again. But you guys did awesome. Love to know more about it, and ended up being able to build that into relationships. And now where we are available to work with any of the dunkers that are hired for the NBA dunk contest, they get the option to work with us. And some of them take advantage of it, some of them don't. But the ones that do come in very prepared, come in with a professional mindset, and usually do very, very well.
So it is incredible to me for a number of reasons, but I can't get over the competitive nature, because I would have done something very similar of them asking, what can we be prepared for? And you being like, go away. I love that. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is that it sounds like, at least to me, these techniques and, that sort of scientifically you discovered that helped you improve, you were able to teach and pass very quickly to professional athletes that kind of understood their body.
Yeah, so the dunk contest is a very unique scenario in that these guys are professional basketball players. Right. Dunking is a part of basketball, but the people who are really, really good at dunking generally aren't basketball players. There are people who maybe play basketball, but they're not spending hours working on the technique of these dunks, right? So an NBA guy who accepts, they may get 3 or 4 practices, right? You're also in season. If you're a guy who plays a lot, like I worked with Donovan Mitchell, and they flew us out to go work with them in Salt Lake City. He played an overtime game the night before, and the team was like, no, you can't dunk today. So we went there and just talked, right? We couldn't get any practice in. Like the basketball side of things, it obviously trumps the 15 minutes of the dunk contest. So, right. With that said, a lot of these guys are very underprepared. So my job is to do a lot of the legwork for them, right? They're going to come in with a few ideas of their own. I want to make sure that they're going to make those, right? So we're going to work on the technique to make sure we give them the best advantage to make those dunks as possible. And then, given how much time we have, we're going to try to suggest some things, right? So somebody like Glenn, we're able to get 4 practices in. We're able to suggest a lot of things. Some guys, it's only a couple practices. We're suggesting less. We're trying not to change too much. It's a balance between getting them to try new things, getting them to be confident. Like, there's a lot of psychology in this, right? And you're going out there and you have to make your dunk the first try. So you have to, balance out what you're pushing, what you're changing versus, what you're just giving them the tools to do a little bit better. There's some small technical things that we can do in terms of how you hold the ball, where you jumped from, the angle that you take. Like there's some small things that all do in there. That's a lot of jump technique or dunk technique related changes, but it's very, very small. It might be moving an inch here, it might be establishing a step, your start point 1 foot further over, or things like that. And I'm not telling them what it's for. I'm just saying, hey, stand here next time you do it and see how that goes.
Right.
Usually it goes better. Then we say, okay, well, I'll make some notes. And when I give them the notes, I'm like, hey, you're going to stand exactly here when you start this, things like that.
Well, it's so funny because the way you describe that is not terribly dissimilar from the way I would work on somebody's jump shot. I don't want to completely reinvent the wheel in a 20 to 25 minute workout. I want to say, hey, I noticed this about your guide hand. Try it this way. Let me know how it feels. Exactly. And it kind of sounds like that kind of approach.
And sometimes there's a vibe and you get in there and you work with the guy and maybe they're in their head a little bit, and we'll back off a little bit, kind of let them work their way through it. And we're not trying to change everything. But it's the idea of like, these guys are not professional dunkers. They're professional basketball players, and we're not trying to make them go out and always do the craziest things possible. We want them to have confidence and make their dunks and give them the tools to put on a good show for themselves, not necessarily try to blow the world away. Although some guys do, like Mac, and some of these guys over the years have done some pretty incredible things. It's not always about that.
Sure. Now, you mentioned earlier, you revealed a little bit of your age, talking about something that predates YouTube, and I think it's about the time of the podcast where you and I really reveal that we're old guys. Because when you say Glenn Robinson III, I immediately think about you and I, being children and watching his dad.
Yeah.
And one thing I know about both of us is we're both tattoo enthusiasts, but your sleeve has gone in a little bit different of a direction than my sleeve. You have some iconic dunking moments tattooed on yourself. Our listeners are not going to have any idea what's going on, but for our viewers, I don't want to be missing anybody, but I know for a minimum you have a huge Vince Carter piece and a huge Jordan piece, and I imagine that these stem from hugely iconic moments of your childhood. So
absolutely.
I'm imagining, Chase, that you working on the dunk contest is like a full circle, like, wow, this is the thing I grew up watching thing.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm the kid that watched every moment of All-Star Weekend, right? Like every moment. It recorded everything if I could, went back and watched it. Obviously, the dunk contest you had to watch live. Like I remember the Vince Carter dunk that I have tattooed. I remember jumping over my couch. I was so excited, like, the whole deal. So, this was kind of a homage to the sport itself, but then it's getting more niche into All-Star Weekend and the dunk contest and things that I never thought I would ever be able to influence or be a part of. Just a little side note for my 30 for 31 day is I lead the NBA dunk contest in assists.
There we go.
Yeah. To be a person who is and was a huge fan of it, to be able to influence it, that was something I never thought was going to be possible. So, it's always a big joy for me to get that email to say, hey, here's your tickets and, here's your flight, blah, blah. It's never lost on me. So, I wanted to kind of put that in ink, so to speak, and hired a guy, Steve, who's one of the most well-known artists around, Steve Butcher. He does pieces for NBA guys and lots of realistic stuff. He's done a bunch of iconic kind of Kobe pieces and things like that. He did He did a couple of pieces on my arm. He's from New Zealand. He actually flew up to California, and the timing worked out. But with that, the very next day that I posted it, it was on ESPN and it was on The Jump.
It was crazy.
It was on all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was pretty crazy to see the reaction kind of blow up like that. Yeah.
It's a really, and I mean, I'm not saying this to blow smoke. It's a really good tattoo. Yeah, I mean, that's insane. The detail is insane.
Yeah, so. Steve's an incredible artist, and whatever photo you give him, it's going to look exactly like that. It just so happens that these photos are from the 80s and 80s and 90s, so there's a little bit of kind of age to them. But if you give him the most vibrant, the highest quality photo that you could think of, it's going to look exactly like that.
It's funny you say this. Something about our age, though, is actually helpful when looking back on photos. It almost like expands the myth of the event taking place. So like when you watch Jordan or Dominique dunk in the late 80s and the film is a little bit grainy, it almost helps you sort of imagine this like dream sequence of them dunking. High definition has been great for sports, but that like grainy late 80s, early 90s, like I'm even thinking like J.R. Ryder, like East Bay Funk Dunk. Those are those moments where they almost feel like a dream because of the way they look.
It's that. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out for me and my social media with all the grainy footage from my days. It's not good for throwback posts, but I wish it had that same effect on Instagram.
Oh man, we're gonna hopefully somebody listens to this that just does like dynamic video editing and it's just like I got you. So I got one more question about dunking because I also want to talk strength and conditioning, which I know you're very passionate about. But because you're in Las Vegas, I have a tie-in for you. One of my favorite movie scenes in my lifetime is the final scene of Ocean's 11, where they're standing outside the Bellagio and no one says a word. They all just kind of look at one another and they're like, wow, we just did that. We just did that. And that's kind of how the movie ends. I would ask you in your history, because you've accomplished so much physically, do you have what I would describe as a Bellagio dunk? Something where like, because obviously you're always thinking bigger and better because that's how athletes work. But do you ever have one that you stuck where you can look back in hindsight and you're like, I did that?
Yeah, I think so. There's a dunk that I created. I was the first person to do, but I was also the first person to do in a contest. And we always like people who are dunkers, so to speak. There's what we call like YouTube dunkers or like Instagram dunkers, people that can make a dunk, right, and post a video. But it's a whole other thing to go and do it in a live event and be able to do
One
it
take live,
first try,
right?
right? That's a whole nother level of mastery. So with that, there's a dunk. I actually taught it to Larry Nance Jr. and he did it in the NBA dunk contest. But I threw it off the backboard, jumped up, caught it in the air, threw it off the backboard again, and I would reverse it. So I did that in a dunk contest, and that was the first time it had ever been done. So I really like that moment. Was pretty cool to have something to show in history is like that's mine, and anybody that does it like from now on, like they got it from that. That's a pretty cool deal. But with the NBA contest, just to add one more, it was the ride to the dunk contest in 2017. It was myself and Chuck, and it was Aaron Gordon and Derek Jones Jr. and Glenn in the bus riding over to the event together, and knowing that like history was going to be changed from there. Like they were going to be working with professionals from here on out. Like that was a really cool moment to like know what's happening in the moment. Like it wasn't lost on like how things were going to change from there.
That's so awesome. I'm so excited you got to have that too. Last question before we segue, because now we're going to talk about work for athletes and stuff like that. But there's something I'm thinking about because you're so scientific minded, and I know a lot of coaches like this. What seems normal to you in terms of the work you put in and grinding every day might not be normal to somebody else. So I know you're going to answer this casually, which is kind of the intent. But if you can give me an idea, how much time were you working every day to improve your physicality once you started making these discoveries in your early 20s? Like, give me a time frame a day.
This is on top of working, on top of having a mortgage, on top of having a wife, on top of having all that other stuff, at least 20 hours a week.
So it's almost like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge to our listeners.
Yeah, it's like college.
Yeah. If you want to see improvement, you have to work for it.
Yeah, it was no nonsense. It was an obsession. It was like I changed the way, not just the simple stuff that you would think of, like the way you eat and the things that you drink or the way that you work out, the mindset, that sort of stuff. I literally changed like the way I would position my body to sleep. Like it was that level of obsession to try to just maximize any little advantage that I could.
So we've actually never talked about this, but I keep that. I'm on like a weatherman right now. There you go. That Spartan race medal I keep because basically summer after I finished my first year of grad school, I was 23 turning 24. I lost 40 pounds in a summer and trained like a maniac and then ran an endurance race. And I have this picture. So like my Bellagio moment is I have this picture of my dad and you could see it's my dad holding me after I crossed the finish line. And I like couldn't even smile. I was so tired. And you could tell just by the look on my dad's face that he was like, I didn't see him doing that ever. And I have a feeling that like, as you started making those types of improvements, those are the moments that like give you that Bellagio feeling that we're talking about. Like you probably didn't see what was happening, but once you got to, oh my God, the results are coming in, a couple months down the line, I imagine that feeling is addictive.
Yeah, and it definitely wasn't even months. It was like sticking to it for years, right?
Let's
And it
go.
was, I remember in 2008. I remember writing down specifically in a notepad like 3 goals, and I wanted to be able to dunk consistently in games. I wanted to be
Okay.
able to do like Showtime type, I'm talking windmills and things like that. I wanted to be able to, this was way before I was barely making 1 out of 10 dunks at this time. I wanted to be able to do dunks like that in games. And then I wanted to be able to hit my head on the rim. Now,
Okay.
I set that one as like an absurd goal. In my mind,
High
it
in the
wasn't
sky kind of
something I was
thing. Yeah.
high in the sky. It wasn't something I was going to do. And then it was just a matter of just never quitting, never like stopping. And it just continued to build and build and build. And once I saw some success, it was more motivating to get in there. Right. But in the beginning, it was a lot of like, I'm in the weight room, I'm doing different things. I'm doing things that nobody else is doing. And you hear the snickers, you hear the like, why are you doing that kind of stuff?
Right.
And then fast forward years later, the people are like, hey, I was sitting in a bar and I saw you on ESPN or whatever the case may be. And I just like think back to those moments in training and like nobody really believed in what you were doing. But if you stick to it for long enough, who knows what can happen.
I love that. And I think this gives us a perfect avenue to dovetail into the science set. So first of all, I appreciate you sharing what you shared. I got like, it was more personal than I was expecting. So I really appreciate you sharing that stuff. And it fires me up because it's the competitor in you. So now let me ask, at what point do you also realize, hey, there's an injury prevention component to this, and we're actually making people, it's not just that we're increasing a skill set, but like what we're doing is making people healthier and stronger and more physically resilient. How does that come along?
So there's a few ways that people go about trying to make big changes in their vertical jump, and a lot of it comes back to like track, right? In track and field, you kind of have this block periodization, and you get stronger. You build the muscle up bigger. You worry about strength, and you worry about kind of transitioning that into like a realization phase and making it show up on the track, right? So you're kind of doing this longer term build for a specific moment. Well, I was a basketball player and I was playing consistently, right? So I didn't want to have this slow build, right? So I started thinking about how to do things a little differently. Did a lot of research into how long do certain strength qualities last. Things like max strength. They'll maybe last about 28 days without training them. Things like really quick, fast movements like sprint speed and things like that. They're going to last about 7 days, maybe without training them, right? So with that, I started formulating a plan on how I could continually build all these things up all at once without having these big lulls where I just feel terrible all the time. Right.
Right.
And in terms of like block periodization, if you're doing like a traditional block style and you're doing hypertrophy block, you're going to be sore all the time while you're continuing to play. Now you have to accept some of that, and you're going to still have some of that, but periodic, the way that you pair things together and plan, you can minimize some of those effects while also still getting the greater global effects that you're trying to get over a longer period of time. So it may not be the quickest way to do it, right? In terms of like, hey, if I have a goal for 12 weeks, maybe I do a block periodization or something like that, right? But if I'm thinking like, I just want to be the best that I can be for a long time, right? There's ways to go about planning that I think are a little bit more effective to keep the main thing, which for me, dunking wasn't the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
Playing basketball was the main thing. So I just thought about things a little bit differently. A lot of trial and error, a lot of trying different things and having things not work, trying things and liking a certain part of it, keeping it. So it's a long-winded long explanation to say that, there's a lot of research, a lot of trial and error, and a lot of experimentation to find out what worked for me, what worked for my body. And if I do it for the person next to me, they may respond a little bit differently. And we have to find the dosage, the kind of appropriate level of volume and whatnot to make it work for them without burying them as well.
That sort of brings us to a subject that I think is really important, which is strength and conditioning at the high school level. I have my reasons to sort of explain to young people, like if I work with someone in a consult, and this even happened with someone I was working with last week, where I was like, hey, there are certain things that if you seriously want to play at X level, you can get in a gym with someone that really understands how your lower body works, and you can become more explosive, and you can work on your, on your first step, and you can work on your vert, and you can work on your overall, speed and explosiveness. So I think those are all important reasons, aside from injury prevention, which is obviously the biggest one. Longevity is the thing we're working to protect. But I think that more high school athletes that are serious about, especially an individual sport focus, should be doing strength and conditioning. From your perspective, and especially given the type of clientele that you are working with at Project Pure Athlete, why do you want to see more young people doing this?
So, like you said, it's injury prevention is first and foremost, in that you're doing a sport dynamically, right? You're running, you're sprinting, you're cutting. There's contact. There's so many variables that are dangerous in an aspect, right? They're violent collisions, with whether it just be between you and another person or you and the ground, right? Those collisions are violent, right? So preparing your body for those collisions is the best way to make sure you can continue to play day in and day out. And as a sports coach, like the time matters, right? So if I'm missing time because my knee hurts, or missing time because I'm constantly, struggling with pain when I'm running or whatnot, those are missed hours to get better, right? So
Right.
in order to kind of maximize our journey, we have to do enough preparation for our body to be able to withstand the loads that we want to put on it. So with that, there's it's I'm trying to think of the right way to say it, but it's it's I think it'd be short-sighted not to include that almost the whole way through the journey, right? At some level, whether if it's at a young age, maybe it's just learning how to move better, maybe it's just some calisthenics, maybe it's it could be any number of things, but preparing your body to cut in and out of positions better, maybe help you cut safely or cut safer. Helping your body, do some light hops and skips will help it self-organize to be able to land safer, right?
Mhm.
You can progress into isometrics and progress into some lighter loading, and eventually you just continue to build and build and build, much the way that like a physiotherapist, if you're coming in for an injury, would start with a really low kind of on the scale of things. They would start on the lower end of shortening the movements, lightening the load, teaching you how to just lower, right? And then continue to add on layers and add on layers and add on layers. That's the same thing we're going to do with in the weight room. If you have a longer term plan, it just starts lower in the spectrum.
I love the way you answered that, because I think that would be very easy for someone that doesn't have a ton of familiarity with the weight room to follow. We all have to start somewhere, and then we build on it.
Mhm.
And obviously, and I'm going to plug this, you're going to see links to Project Pure Athlete and Coach Chase's channel in the podcast description. But something else you'll see if you click those links is some video footage of Coach Chase's two young kids doing some of this work. So, you are not only just giving this message, you're not like, I would say, like someone that works in Silicon Valley that, goes home and tells his kids not to use Instagram, but then builds Instagram. You want your kids doing the stuff that you believe in. And with that in mind, you understand the human body. You have a lot of this knowledge in your own training. Is there anything that you're currently doing with your kids, or that your kids are doing exercise-wise, that you would encourage parents of young kids to do with theirs?
So if nothing else, teach them how to warm up. Include mobility in the warm up. Like it could be some basic like lunges in multiple directions, like forward, backward, sideways, things like that. Teach them how to hinge. Teach them how to push their hips back to get into stretch their hamstrings out. But then track drills, right? A skips, B skips, C skips, pogo hops. Little simple things like that. You just do those for a long enough period of time. You begin to get more athletic, especially at a young age. There's and in my experience with some of the research, there's a lot of data that says that you build up a lot of your elastic qualities, before you're 10 years old or so. So
Wow.
those pogo hops and A skips and B skips and C skips, those sorts of things just are low impact ways to just build up some of those contacts while also building up proper running form and things like that. So they're just, I think, easy to learn, low in terms of impact, and high in terms of long-term benefits in terms of what you're doing in sport.
So a couple of times already, just as we've been chatting, you alluded to, fear of an overuse injury or overworking or overloading. And I know in some of our previous conversations, just we were getting to know one another before we recorded, we've also talked about, if you look at almost strength and conditioning plus your sport training plus your actual competing as like a full plate and a balanced diet, where strength conditioning fits in. So I would ask you, because God knows someone's listening to this and a parent or a player is going, it's too much. It's too much. What to you does strength and conditioning look like as a supplement to an athlete's primary sport?
That's where having a coach that you can talk to matters, right? And that we all have different demands on our sport. Some people are just going to their team practices a couple hours a week, and that's their extent of their physical workout, right? Others are, it's like some of the kids that I know, they're putting in 20, 25 hours a week at this. With that said, the athlete that's putting 25 hours a week, there's a high demand on their body already. So the strength coach has to supplement what they're doing in a smart way to not overload them with, okay, if an athlete comes and says that they want to jump higher, immediately people will think about plyos and things like that. Well, if an athlete's on the court 20 hours a week, I don't necessarily want to go load them up with a bunch more plyos. That's just more volume of high intensity contacts that they probably already have a ton of, right? What that athlete probably needs is more tissue tolerance. They probably need more general strength. We may need to look at some tightness issues that are limiting the way that they move. So you need to think about training in a global aspect and not necessarily just like everything needs to look exactly like what I want the output to be, right? So not all jump training is jumping. Right. Sometimes jump training is slow movements, right? And that's how you get the bigger benefits. I just like to think of it in terms of what's missing and then make sure we cover all the bases, and then we can turn up the volume or turn down the volume on things as we want to focus on them.
I love that. And that's actually kind of a good segue into how I want to end with you, because you're obviously very invested in Project Pure Athlete right now. You're one of the jump guys. And I also know, in addition to just, the benefits of increasing your vert and increasing your leg strength, you are really looking at physical development pretty holistically and developing individualized plans for people. So if someone is working with you, either in person or remotely, what can they kind of expect based on some of the stuff you just shared from Project Pure Athlete?
So I tell everyone that I'm very honest in that what gets people to me is the jumping. What gets people to me is the jump technique and things like that are a little bit different than what other people are doing. But that's probably the least important part of what we're going to do, especially for basketball players, right? With basketball players, the contact is where really things change, right? So through my years of training, I became a much better defender. I became a much more physical player, finished through contact a lot better, right? And so we optimize the way that we load, especially like upper body, things that are a little less direct to the sport. We optimize the way that we load them to think counter impact movements, right? So think if you're a defender, somebody's trying to hit you in the shoulder to turn you to get that advantage, right? We want to be able to take that contact through the shoulder and stay rigid. So bump them further out, give us more time to stay in front of them, or vice versa. Like we want to have the core strength to be able to punch through somebody's shoulder and turn them if we're the offensive player. So a lot of things that we do are going to be offset loaded. A lot of things that we do are going to be putting us in athletic positions where we have to maintain a neutral core and a strong, stable position while we're going through other movements. These, like, I put so much effort and thought into overall design for the actual sport to make sure that we're really covering the athlete as a whole and not just running, jumping, because running and jumping are two things that like look good, but they're not the things that you're using all the time. It's the deceleration, it's the contact, it's the resilience, it's being able to play lower and wider feet on defense. It's being able to keep your chest up and while you're on defense in those low positions. Like those are the things that are going to make you a better player on every possession, not just the 2 or 3 times that you get the opportunity to jump really high.
I love that. And what I'm about to say, I really mean sincerely, because I've actually talked to a young athlete about something very similar to what we're talking about right now. It's funny to me that you have shared that, these were your original goals. You wanted to increase your basketball playing career, get better at the game, be more physically resilient. And as a byproduct of those things, you started jumping out of the gym, and then you set some new goals, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And what I would encourage athletes that are hearing your story to really, really take home from this, because this has been super, super insightful, Coach. I would encourage you to remember that when you set goals and when you really start working towards them, the world also keeps spinning and you start accomplishing other things too. And I would imagine that this journey has taken you places you would have never imagined when you first got on it. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, absolutely. I never had the goal of having a business in training. Like I said, I worked full
Right.
time before that, right? It was something that just a passion for, improving myself, like kind of a selfish pursuit, led to a knowledge base that was able to help other people. And even then, it was like I was helping other people. I never had the idea of having the business, right? At some point, I was thinking back about me as a 15, 16-year-old kid who was really trying to get better. What were the resources that I had to go through? And I wanted to create a resource that was much easier to manage, right? Somebody who had a blueprint already ready to help that athlete, that was willing to put in the work, was willing to do, whatever it took to kind of reach that goal, but that didn't have the know-how. So that's kind of where I decided I needed to start putting this information out. But it's just turned into a business through kind of people. It's crazy to me that, like, I just had two athletes, one from where were they from? They were from Delaware, and another from Pennsylvania this week, fly in and stay in Vegas to come train with me. And that's like, those things always blow my mind. It's like, as a kid that I couldn't even afford a local trainer, much less a fly across the country and stay there for weeks to train with somebody. Like, it's always humbling to have that. But so I wanted this information to be out there for that kid, not necessarily for the business.
Absolutely. And look at that. We're stacking more and more of those Bellagio moments. You put in this work. You don't exactly know what you're going to get out of it, but you have goals, and look at where the work takes you and enjoy the process. And we can find more information by following you at Jump Guy Chase, checking you out at projectpureathlete.com. Again, those links are available in the podcast descriptions. Coach Chase Skinkis, thank you so much for jumping on. And I really think this was super valuable. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot for having me on.
That's going to do it for another episode of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you got something out of today's podcast. If you'd like to learn more about anything related to Nail the Recruiting Process, the book, my work, maybe wanting to work with me one-on-one, anything under the sun, you're going to visit www.nailtherecruitingprocess.com. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can follow me at Nail the Recruiting Process on Instagram, or at Jared the Coach on Twitter and TikTok. Both of those handles are just one word, no characters, no spaces. If you'd like to ask something of me directly, if you'd like a question that maybe you want answered on a future podcast, or if you have an idea for something we should talk about in a future episode, please reach out to me via email. I would love to hear from you. My email address is recruitinggear@gmail.com. That's the word recruiting, then the word gear combined. recruitinggear@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to catch you next time.